Okay, so welcome everybody. It looks like we have a bunch of people here, which is great to see. Um, so just a couple of starter notes here. First of all, it's great to see so much interest. There's a lot of talk about accessibility these days, and it's great to see that it's kind of coming more into people's workflow as like more of a primary consideration. Um, Quick warning, it's Claritin season in Pennsylvania in the Northeast, and the war on pollen is real. So just bear with me. Hopefully, I don't get too many coughing and sneezing attacks going on. Um, but so yeah, this is a big topic. It's broad. You can go really deep with it. It changes quite a bit over time. Um, Not as fast as some of the other technologies that we use or some of the other processes, so that's good. We can get a handle on it. But there's a lot here. I probably have enough. I was thinking I probably should have broken this into like two talks. um, but we'll go with what we have right now. It's a lot of good information, and I think it's always good to look at the group that we have here on the call. It looks like, based on some of the other talks, that this is, probably a pretty intermediate to advanced group. So I might save a little bit of time in my slides and skip over some of the 101 stuff. But I'll always leave time for questions at the end. Any comments? I have a couple slides with resources as well. So accessibility, in my mind, it's an ongoing strategy. It's an ongoing conversation. So we have a lot of resources, a lot of channels, social media channels, Slack, um, different types of office hours and things. A lot of organizations putting out good material. So in other words, like, in short, like keep in touch, if I can help, afterwards and so on. Um, we'll probably run out of time when I get towards the end of the slides, but we'll see how much we can fit in. So this is embracing a new era of web accessibility with WCAG 2.2. So it's a mouthful, I know, but basically we're talking about web accessibility. There have been new developments with WCAG. We'll talk about what WCAG is, if that's a new term. And we're at version 2.2 right now. So this is just a little bit about me. I've been around the web for an amazingly long time. It feels like almost 30 years. Started writing HTML in the 90s. Sounds crazy. Here's a bunch of channels that I hang out at. I'm generally GTO1 or McPhillies, and kind of our usual group of channels here. I've been fortunate enough to work on a lot of great projects. Some within, academia, some outside of academia. But I primarily focus on Drupal, so that's kind of part of the name of this talk. But as you probably are aware, a lot of the accessibility topic is important on the web, no matter what tools we're using to build. So, but anyway, and then top left, this list here. This is kind of a check, all right? Like we're all really busy, and not that, accessibility should be at the bottom of the list. Certainly not. I didn't intend for that to insinuate that, but the one of the points of the talk is that we can work accessibility checks into our workflow. There we have some really great tools to do that, to help us out there and get scores and so on. Um, and so this is the big message. So by adding accessibility checks to your workflow, you can help up to 1 billion people around the world to use the web. So this is a table of contents. This is sort of the breakdown of the talk. So talking about what web accessibility is, why it's important, what's new in WCAG 2.2, And then I'm a visual person, so I like to see examples of things, um, visual examples. So looking at things, how they pan out, like in a web UI, for example. So I have a couple examples of some of the new site success criteria for WCAG 2.2. And then if time allows, I have a case study. I'm working to improve the Drupal developer portal. So if you're familiar with Drupal, you may be familiar with the dev portal. We're doing a bunch of stuff there, and making it more and more valuable, more and more easily accessible for the Drupal community. So that's just that's one implementation of some of these practices. And then I have a handful of slides around, creating a strategy for your organization and how to get accessibility going in your workflow. All right, so what is accessibility? Um, and it's not all about disability. I think the term is evolving, and we're talking more about inclusion. So both for our team, the people that we work with, and of course the users of our end product. It's about future proofing and staying feature rich as technology becomes more touch friendly and voice driven. I really like this quote here by Dries, who's the founder of Drupal, if you're not familiar. Um, Especially the middle line here, accessibility is all about promoting inclusion. And it's important, I recently, as I'm sort of getting back into accessibility, I'm realizing that it's as important for our colleagues and our teams, the people that we work with, as it is for like the front end result of our products. So it's a bigger topic, it's a deeper topic, but ultimately accessibility benefits everyone. So it's good to embrace the new concept of shift left. Um, Three types of accessibility in IT: software, mobile, and web. Not going to spend a lot of time here. I will also share these slides if anybody wants to grab them at the end. But software, mobile, and web, uh, a lot of this is overlap, so we're talking about some success criteria that really fall into all three camps. But it is important to kind of break that apart and, be aware that there are three types in IT. Um, Today, we're talking about web, of course. So what do we use to measure accessibility? We use this thing called the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, or WCAG. This was developed as an international standard years ago by the W3C. And the goal is a global push to create web and digital experiences that are truly inclusive. This was kind of my introduction to accessibility. This goes back quite a long time. As a web developer at Penn State years ago. And I should say, going all the way back to 2011, there was a big event where the National Federation of the Blind actually brought a lawsuit to the university because a lot of its properties, its web properties, were not ADA compliant. And long story short, with a couple presidents of things, CTOs, and several lawyers involved, it was a peaceful resolution that actually ended up with a lot of great resources. The university and all the developers that were involved, and the site owners, the whole web community really stepped up, said basically, my bad, and let's make this better. So we had a whole accessibility initiative kick off at that time as a result. And we created a lot of resources, not just for the university, but for people around the web to use. This is a screenshot of a site that's been around for a really long time, and has all kinds of great web accessibility resources. There was also an active initiative to educate everybody, in the communications departments and, of course, all the web departments, digital media, and so on, around the university. So this is kind of where I got started, and it was a real awakening, but it was a great educational event. And so I've been working on it, off and on, trying to get more into it these days, trying to get more involved as in the web developer community. And just part of the reason for doing this talk today. Um, so quick history, WCAG 1.0 started in 1999. It was, of course, at that time, mainly focused on HTML. And right up to today, we have WCAG 2.2. So this was actually an update with 9 new success criteria that was released in October of 2023. When we're using WCAG, it's important to keep in mind that we have 3 levels. So single A, double A, and triple A. Single A is the sort of the bare minimum, and double A is the mid-range, and triple A is kind of the gold standard. In my experience, it's good to kind of shoot for double A, at least when you're starting out. It gives you a nice sort of midpoint, understanding, and some data to go off of to improve your sites. It's also important to understand the scope. So when we're talking about accessibility, we're talking about assistive technologies. So we have a large target demographic that uses assistive technologies to help with visual impairments, hearing impairments, motor impairments, and cognitive impairments. So important to understand the scope. So why do it? Well, first, you can get in trouble for not doing it. That's not the only reason, of course. It's not even the best reason, but it's a good reason. And I'm no legal expert, and I can't tell you how many times I've started down this rabbit hole of starting to read about um, new, historic, changing accessibility guidelines around the world. In all honesty, it's hard enough to get through, the rules and regulations just in the United States, as someone who works in the United States and largely has a United States user base. But the point is, and the recommended approach is, do your research. So, and focus on the regions where the countries where you are, where you work, and where your users are. So this, and I have this research here, or sorry, this link here, iflegal.com. This is one of the best resources I've found. I'm not going to deep dive into any of this right now, but this is a really great place to start. It's certainly not a canonical source, but the important part is keeping in mind, not only where you want to be right now, but also paying attention to, being aware of the changes that come about. So in the US, for example, just recently in the past couple of weeks, we have a new rule. It's literally called a rule. This is a screenshot of the PR, the press release for it, and you can see it came out very recently on April 8th. This is signed off on by the US Department of Justice. And the Attorney General says, yeah, we're going to make this a new rule. The rule itself is over here on the right, sort of the important parts. And the new updated rule is that state and local governments now, their web and their mobile apps have to be compliant with WCAG version 2.1 level double A. And so to define, who is responsible for these success criteria, here's a screenshot here, and all this stuff is available online. You can look it up. But if you're working with a university, this means you, right? So public libraries, if you're working for, the subway system, all of this is part of this new mandate. So um, I actually, was really happy to find this Federal Register. It's something I'm going to look at a lot more often now. But in part of, some of the research that I was doing recently, I found this, and so this stuff is really trackable and easy. It's written in a way that's easy to understand. But this new rule is actually effective June 24th of 2024. If you look down towards the bottom of the slide, you can see the dates. So it matters, what size organization you are for when you will actually be, when your deadline is. So that's something that you can look up. But, for a large university, you probably have, 2 years or 3 years, to get into compliance. And again, it's WCAG 2.1 AA. So something to be aware of, something that, get into your workflow and start talking to your teams about. I have all kinds of great slides on a whole bunch of tools and things that you can use to sort of check where you are right now as well. So another another reason for doing it is market reach and inclusivity, market analysis, the potential for the assistive technology market, which is huge, right? This reflects on your brand image. Of course, there's an ethical argument for it. And like I mentioned before, the diversity in all of your key players. So this is part of not only your end users, but the team, right? You can have a more if you have a more inclusive and accessible workflow, technologies that you use on your teams, you can have a more varied and diverse team to work with. All of this points towards embracing accessibility, which drives innovation, right? So it's the right thing to do, but it actually does come around full circle, and it can benefit, us, the developers, the companies, the universities, whoever's doing it. So it's good for everybody. High tide lifts all boats, kind of a thing. And the population that we're talking about is 1 billion people worldwide that use assistive technologies. This is a common acronym that you might see if you start looking around. So essentially, you want your tools and your products to be perceivable, operable, understandable, and robust. It's a good thing to keep in mind. Easy thing to remember. Some things, some topics, some success criteria that we all probably have come up against up until this point are things like form fields, right? Making our form fields accessible. Video captions, right? Webinars, virtual events, having those captions available in one way or another, or maybe multiple ways, is always a great idea. Meaningful hyperlink text. All of these things are at this point pretty, what I would say, low-hanging fruit. These are all things that we should have on our radars. We should be checking for these things. We should have been checking for these things for years at this point. But yeah, this is a very recent report, the wave analysis from WebAIM, which checks the top 1 million websites. I believe that is the top 1 million by traffic. And you can see here that almost all the pages have at least one WCAG 2.0 failure, and the average number of errors per homepage is 61, which is, in all honesty, not hard to believe. If you've ever come onto a site that maybe you inherited, or a site that's been around for a while, and you want to check the accessibility on it. Having 60 is kind of, it's not awesome, but it's actually kind of to be expected. And so it takes work, and it takes, it's like maintaining your sites and updating your modules and checking your security. It's one of those things that takes, a good amount of effort. So to, come to a site that's been around for a while, it's not surprising that you're going to have some errors. A brand new site is probably going to have some errors too, but it's a lot easier to fix the errors on a brand new site, fix 15 errors on a brand new site than it is to fix 150 on a 15-year-old site. And a lot of these things are, again, part of this like low-hanging fruit category that I'm talking about. So low contrast text, missing image alt text, empty links, this kind of stuff. It really doesn't take a lot, to fix these types of errors. I can't say that about all of them, but there's a lot of hope, and we can put strategies in place to get these things cleaned up. And it's not just the homepage of your site or the sub pages. It's a lot of the downloadable media and things. So as a quick example and an exercise for me, I made this slide deck accessible. And I did that with a tool called Grackle, and you can easily just go get it. And it's really handy as a Chrome add-on. You just open your slides, and you open up the modal to the right, slides out from the left, or sorry, from the right side, and you can run the report. It takes a couple of minutes to run the test, and it will give you this report, and it will tell you where you need to fix things. In all honesty, it never really occurred to me to put alt tags in the images that I use in my slides. But it's like now it's like etched into my brain, because I had to go back and add about 100 alt tags to these images. So, and again, like it's not hard. It just takes a little bit of time and effort to get it into your workflow. Okay, so this is really the heart of what I want to get at. So let's look at WCAG 2.2. This is a super boring and text heavy slide, so I won't linger on it. But basically, these are the 9 new success criteria for WCAG 2.2. If you're unfamiliar, all of the success criteria in WCAG have these numbers associated with them, which is great for looking them up, tracking them, communicating about them, and so on. A lot of times the tools that we use will give us the number. I guess it's called a success criteria number, along with like the readout in a report, which is also really helpful. So you can go and look it up by its number. So we have these 9 new success criteria for 2.2. So just to look at a couple examples for each one. So 2.4.11 is called focus not obscured, and this is the AA criteria. So ensure that when an item gets keyboard focus, so if a user is tabbing through your site, the focus is at least always partially visible. So this is a flag here. And these examples, I was watching the Phillies when I was putting some of this talk together. So a lot of these are from the MLB.com site, which I thought was kind of a neutral, unless hopefully nobody here is from MLB, or maybe you are and reach out. But it's fine. The site is great. It's a fantastic site. But these are just some of the examples that I found. So for this first success criteria, this would be something that you could probably improve with some JavaScript maybe, right? So when you tabbed to that the Washington Nationals there, it would be as visible on the screen as the Braves, the Phillies, and the Mets. And then this is also common about these success criteria. So 2.4.12, it's again focus not obscured, but it's the enhanced version. So this is how you can get to AAA. This improves on the previous one, 2.4.11. ensuring that the entirety of the focus indicator must be accessible. So this would be a flag here because, when you're going over into whatever game this is, as you're tabbing through, you would tab across the main navigation, and then you would bump down to the Minnesota-Detroit line with all these games and all their box scores and so on. You'd want that, again, to be like fully visible when it's tabbed and in focus. 2.4.13, focus appearance. So use an outline or other significant indicator around the perimeter of a focused element that is at least 2 pixels thick and has sufficient contrast. So this is as you're tabbing through, and I came down to this a positively wonderful reception for Lindor. You can click on that title and go into a deeper story there. So I can tab through and I can see which one is in focus, right? Which element on the page is in focus. And this is at least a 2 pixel wide box. The color contrast is high enough. So that's a nice success right there. All right, so 2.5.7 has to do with dragging movements. This is AA. Make sure that there is a way for a mouse or touch user to still perform the same action using other means. I'm not sure this description here is ideal, but you basically, if there's a drag and drop movement for your average user, you want users with assistive technologies to be able to still have that functionality through other means. So, for example, here, I thought this would put it to the test, tabbing through the MLB film room, and I can tab down into the video player, and all of this functionality that normally you can, of course, access with a mouse or with your trackpad. You can access all of this, tabbing through and using the arrows, for example. So that was my test. The play, the pause, the volume, fast forward, rewind, closed captioning, full screen, even scrubbing through the video itself was all accessible. So that was a good test. And then we have 2.5.8, the target size minimum. So this has to do with, the UI elements and ensuring that any of these targets, things that people might click on for one reason or another, are at least 24 by 24 pixels. And or you can use spacing to meet this criteria. So I found the smallest element on the screen, and I just did the inspect to check out what size this, the magnifying glass and the search feature was. And it looks to be, 41 by 40. So plenty large enough size to meet that criteria. And then 3.2.6 is consistent help. This is actually a single A criteria. So design your UI and functionality so that the help resources are consistently available, especially concerning placement and functionality. So the larger your site, the larger your site, the more difficult this is going to be to check. If you kind of have a smaller site and you have like one chat help or one link button, it's pretty straightforward, which is pretty much the case here. But I kind of dove deeper across the different MLB environments, or the different sites. So these 3 sites, they're all MLB. I believe they're all in some version the MLB.com domain. But they're sort of 3 different sites, sort of one big site, because you can navigate around through them, right? If you're there as a baseball fan. And but the one on the left, which is, I think it's just MLB.com, there's a consistency in the contact us in the footer, right? So that checks out. MLB.TV, which it's a separate site essentially. It's kind of a separate experience, but it is pretty well linked, to the previous page there, to the MLB.com. Within this sort of sub-site, it's also consistent. So there's a help option in the top right. And then finally, if you drill into one of the individual teams, so of course I was looking at the Phillies, there's a chat button, sorry, a chat experience in the bottom right, which you can see there. So I kind of, I said, well, this is kind of like a lot of things in accessibility, really, it can end up being sort of a conversation. But so we have consistent help in each of these sort of subsites. You could argue that, it's not exactly consistent, like even across the three, maybe, should all have the same chat help, for example, which would actually be really nice. But anyway, so you want to have your help functionality, whatever it might be, think about, placement and how users access it and keeping that as consistent as possible. And then finally, 3.3.7, redundant entries. So this is something that's been around for us for a long time. If you have a checkout or an e-commerce cart, something like that, if you don't want your users to have to re-enter the same information multiple times. So if you can have something nice and easy, like a checkbox, and say, use your information for your billing information, that's a big plus. 3.3.8, accessible authentication. So this has to do with cognitive, right? So don't require cognitive function tests like a math problem, for example, as part of a CAPTCHA step or other authentication process. The fine print here is that using we've all seen this a million times, check all tap or click the boxes that all have crosswalks in them, right? Which is, of course, not a math problem, but it's a cognitive test. You can actually pass the AA 338 here, as long as you're not using math and you use the image, like, the light post or the stoplight or the, whatever it might be, click all the boxes that have a crosswalk in them. That's actually passable. But if you wanted to get to AAA, you can't do that anymore, right? So you have to have other authentication that doesn't require that, what's called a cognitive test. So no math here, no crosswalk, test here. You have to come up with, some other way, or, do some research for your authentication, your two-step. Okay, so let's see. 1:35. So we got a little bit of time. So this is a case study. This is kind of looking at a big Drupal community site that gets a lot of traffic, and people are working to improve the accessibility score. So this touches on some tools. So I'll kind of call out the tools because I don't think I'm going to have time to get to the slides that specify the tools. But again, like, I'm happy to share the slides. So here, just starting out, I've used, Accessibility, which is one of the tools. If you just go to accessibility.com, it kind of looks like I have a typo down there, but it's just Accessibility. You can run a report on your site, get some good information there. It's a great place to start. You can also use Google Lighthouse. Google Lighthouse offers a handful of different ways to run the tests. And so this is just the browser extension method here. So this had a really nice accessibility score, right? I get the green check mark on one, and I get 100% on the other, which is really fantastic. The point is, though, it's a great place to start, but it's probably best to use a couple of different tools, because Google Lighthouse, for example, as encouraging as that 100% score is, there still might be some issues that you can improve. For example, so here I'm using another tool called Monsito, and this is giving me an initial score here on the left starting out is only 70%. The goal, of course, is to get over 90%. So you start to do the work, right? And depending on the tool that you're using, really what you want it to do is to, besides give you a truthful 100% score, which is, the goal that we all want to hit, you want the data from it. You want it to flag all of your issues and where you can make your improvements. It's not all that hard to start making improvements right off the bat. One strategy that I usually go with is to look at the tool, uh, excuse me, that you're using, and see if you can work with it a little bit. Because a lot of times, depending on the tools that you're using, Monsito included, you don't get as deep of a dive with some of the quick scans like Accessibility and Google Lighthouse, at least not right off the bat. But if you can get like a deeper dive, you can really see the individual issues, right? And I've had, parts of the site get flagged, of any site really, and it'll say something like, this issue is getting flagged because you have a script tag in your code, and the script tag could create screen flicker. And so, as part of this like report auditing step, if I know, that I have, script probably in all my sites, as long as I know that it's not causing flicker, and it's up to you to do the work to be sure of that, you can like turn that off, right? Or you can say, this is being ignored, right? And so you can kind of, play with and sort of customize the checks on, from the reporting tool itself, right? So that's just one example. Generally, then you're going to want to go in and make the changes. So and usually they're going to fall into one of two types of changes: content changes or developer fixes, right? So here, this is an example. I'm going to start talking faster and going through these because I know I'm running out of time. But so content changes, you'd be amazed at how many alt tags are empty out there, or how many alt tags have a value of add alt text here. It's amazing, around the web. So that's some more low hanging fruit, but your scan is going to catch all those. And the important thing is like fix it going forward, so make it so if you have a site that, you have content managers that are adding content, or, content people, make it so they have to add an alt tag. Or, if it's a scenario where, all of the images are generally going to be decorative, make it so the images are always decorative. And if it's a decorative image and you have an alt tag because you're trying to do everything right, you're going to get flagged on that. So if it's a decorative image and you have an alt tag, the checkers are gonna flag that. So if it's decorative, it shouldn't have any alt text. If it's not decorative, it has to have alt text. So depending on your system, this is a Drupal module that looks, pretty amazing here for the simple task that it achieves. So there are different fixes, but the point is like, instruct and guide your content people to make it easier on you going forward. Here's a little success story. You get good results when you teach your content people, what to do. And then you're always gonna have developer and themer changes. So here, this is a nice example of where we can use an ARIA attribute. And you can say ARIA hidden is true. It gives you this nice, in this case, an SVG user experience. But if the assistive technology is reading through this page, you want that technology to not get overloaded, bogged down on, items, elements on the page that it doesn't really need to know about, right? It's not going to think that that's important. It will know about those links, but it doesn't need to know about the cool little graphic there. And so lots of examples there. And if you want to, I'll pause here for a second. If you want to take a QR scan of this, you can actually kick off your first Moncito quick scan. It's one of many tools out there, but this is a nice way to get a look at your first 10 pages of your site, and it's going to give you a report on an accessibility score, a quality assessment, which is going to look at things like misspellings and broken links, and also SEO. So today we're talking about accessibility, but you get a little bit more bang for your buck there. And again, the report will come to you in about an hour, less than an hour, probably. And you can get some good results. So again, this kind of goes back to making sure that you try different tools, test things in different scenarios using different tools, because that same site that gives you a 75% score, let's say, it might be a site that's been around for 10 years or something, and you might get like a deeper dive score of 75%, but here we're looking at just the top 10 pages and I get 100%. So you really need to use a couple different tools to really get the best information and action items that you can start to work on. But then there's always more work to be done. So today in 2024 we should probably be trying to hit WCAG 2.2, at least AA, at least 90%, and that's going to really open up our sites to a lot more people. So implementing into your organization, I think I'm actually going to have the music play here in a minute and get booted. So I'll probably wrap up here, but I'm happy to share these slides if anybody wants to take a look. I kind of have some practical, like getting started next steps. And so I will leave a minute here if anybody has some questions or feedback that they'd like to offer at this time. Otherwise, I'm happy to talk more offline. You can reach out to me. Happy to share the slides, and hopefully this was valuable.